Anchorage, 1983. When a young mother vanished on a cold winter night, police dismissed her as another runaway. For 6 years, the man she loved fought a lonely, desperate battle against their indifference, never knowing the monster who took her was the city's most beloved baker, a man who used the vast, unforgiving wilderness as his personal hunting ground. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. In the Anchorage of 1983, the cold was more than just a temperature. It was a character in every story. A constant, sharp-edged presence that dictated the rhythms of life. For Angela Brooks, the cold was the enemy. It was the biting wind she fought on her late-night walk home from her job cleaning hotel rooms. And it was the chill of the one-bedroom apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Darnell, and their young son, Jordan. A space where the old, rattling heater was always losing the battle against the Alaskan winter. But Angela was a woman made of a quiet, resilient warmth. At 24, her life was a testament to her own inner fire, a steady flame of devotion to the two people who were her entire world. Her days were a study in perpetual motion. She worked the thankless, invisible hours of the night shift, her hands raw from cleaning chemicals, her body aching with a weariness that never seemed to fully recede. But when she came home in the pre-dawn darkness, the exhaustion would melt away the moment she saw her son, his small, sleeping face a perfect, peaceful counterpoint to the harshness of the world. Her dreams were not grand or extravagant. They were small, practical, and deeply felt. A new coat for Jordan, a savings account with 3 digits in it, a life of simple, hard-won stability. Her partner in this daily battle was Darnell Carter. At 26, Darnell was a man whose love for Angela was as fierce, as untamed, and as powerful as the Alaskan landscape itself. An auto mechanic by trade, his hands were perpetually stained with grease and oil, the hands of a man who understood how to fix what was broken. He was a man of intense, sometimes volatile emotions. His temper could flare hot and fast, but it was an anger born not of malice, but of a deep, primal, and incredibly protective love for his family. He saw the quiet, steady strength in Angela, and he adored her for it. Theirs was a partnership forged in the crucible of shared struggles, a bond that was stronger than any legal document, a quiet, unwavering alliance against the cold. Their small apartment was not a place of material wealth, but it was a sanctuary of love. It was a home filled with the smell of Darnell's coffee, the sound of Jordan's laughter, and the quiet, steady presence of Angela, the calm, warm center of their small, defiant universe. They were a family, holding on tight to each other against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Alaskan frontier, their shared warmth the only thing that truly kept the cold at bay. On a bitterly cold night in late November, the temperature plunging into the negative double digits, Angela was walking home from her shift. The city was a ghost town, the streets empty, the snow-covered landscape bathed in the eerie orange glow of the streetlights. The walk was a short one, but in this kind of cold, it was a dangerous journey. Her route took her past the one reliable beacon of warmth in the downtown area, the Daily Bread, a cozy, inviting bakery whose warm, yeasty smell of fresh-baked bread was a comforting, beloved fixture of the city. The owner, a man named Robert Bob Harlow, was a local institution. He was a man in his late 30s, with a soft, friendly face that was always dusted with a fine layer of flour, and a gentle, easy smile that he offered to everyone who walked through his door. He was the picture of small-town, Alaskan charm, a man known for his generosity, his kindness, and his incredible cinnamon rolls. He was a pillar of the community, a man who was universally and completely trusted. He was the last person on earth anyone would ever have a reason to fear. The abduction, when it happened, was not an act of violent back-alley aggression. It was a quiet, gentle, and utterly monstrous betrayal of a community's trust. As Angela hurried past the warm, glowing windows of the bakery, her head down against the biting wind, a small, familiar Cessna airplane parked at the local airfield sat silently under the vast, star-filled Alaskan sky. Its owner was the beloved baker, Bob Harlow, a man who the entire town knew was an accomplished pilot. His plane was not just a hobby. It was an essential part of his life, a symbol of the rugged Alaskan spirit of freedom and adventure. It was also a tool, a silent, terrible accomplice in a secret life that was as dark and as cold as the winter night itself. On that freezing November night, as Angela battled the wind on her lonely walk home, Bob Harlow was just closing up his bakery. He saw her through the large plate glass window, a lone, determined figure hunched against the brutal cold. He saw not a stranger, but a familiar face from the community, a young woman who sometimes came in for a day-old loaf of bread. He also saw an opportunity. He stepped outside, pulling his own warm jacket on, his face a mask of neighborly concern. "Angela, is that you?" he called out, his voice a warm, friendly sound in the frozen, silent air. "You're going to freeze to death out here. This is no night for a walk." Angela stopped, surprised to see him. "Mr. Harlow," she said, her own voice thin and reedy in the cold. "I'm almost home. I'll be okay." "Nonsense," he said, his smile gentle and reassuring. "My truck is right here. Let me give you a ride. I insist. I couldn't sleep tonight knowing I let you walk home in this." She hesitated for only a moment. This was Bob Harlow, the man who gave her son free cookies, the man who donated bread to the local church. He was not a stranger. He was a symbol of the very best of their small, tight-knit community. To refuse his offer would have felt rude, almost insulting. "Well, if you're sure it's no trouble," she said, a grateful smile spreading across her own cold-numbed face. "No trouble at all," he said, opening the passenger door of his truck for her. "Hop in and get warm." She climbed into the cab, the blast of the heater a small, blissful miracle. The interior of the truck smelled of cinnamon and sugar, the sweet, comforting scent of his trade. "Thank you so much, Mr. Harlow," she said, her body beginning to thaw from the bone-deep chill. "You're a good man." He just smiled, a quiet, gentle, and utterly monstrous smile as he pulled away from the curb. "Just being a good neighbor," he said. The warm, inviting bakery, the one reliable beacon of light in the cold, dark city, receded in the rearview mirror, and Angela Brooks, a young woman who was loved, who was needed, who was the center of her own small, beautiful world, was driven away into a darkness from which she would never return. Darnell Carter's world operated on a rhythm of quiet, domestic certainties. He knew that the sound of Angela's key in the lock at 3:30 in the morning was the signal that he could finally, truly, fall asleep. Secure in the knowledge that she was home, that their small family was whole and safe under one roof. He was a light sleeper, a man whose subconscious was perpetually and protectively attuned to her absence. On this night, the silence stretched. 3:30 came and went. Then 4 o'clock. Darnell drifted in and out of a shallow, uneasy sleep, his mind a tense waiting thing. He would wake with a start, his ears straining for the familiar, comforting sound of her return, only to be met with the deep, profound, and unnerving silence of the apartment. By 5 o'clock, as the first, pale, gray light of the Alaskan dawn began to filter through the bedroom window, the quiet hum of anxiety had grown into a loud, insistent, and terrifying alarm. This was wrong. Angela was never late. She was the most reliable, the most predictable, the most responsible person he had ever known. If she was going to be late, she would have called. The hotel had a phone. She would have found a way. He got out of bed, his movements frantic and clumsy in the cold, dim light. He checked on their son, Jordan, who was a small, peaceful lump under a pile of blankets. He paced the small living room, his mind a chaotic storm of worst-case scenarios. A fall on the ice, a sudden, unexpected illness, a car accident. He called the hotel, his voice a tight, strained croak. The night manager, a tired, bored voice on the other end of the line, confirmed that Angela had clocked out on time, a little after 3 a.m. She had left, she had started her walk home, and she had never arrived. The panic was a physical thing now, a cold, crushing weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He threw on his clothes, his hands shaking, and he ran outside, into the brutal, pre-dawn cold. He drove the short route between their apartment and the hotel, his eyes scanning the empty, snow-covered sidewalks, praying to see her, a small, huddled figure, waiting for him. But the streets were empty. His call to the Anchorage Police Department was not the calm, reasoned plea of a concerned citizen. It was the raw, ragged, and furious roar of a man whose world was being torn apart. His temper, the passionate, protective fire that was so much a part of his character, exploded. He yelled at the dispatcher. He demanded that they send every car they had. He screamed that something terrible had happened, that they had to find her. Now, his anger, born of a desperate, helpless love, was the worst possible thing he could have done. It was a language that the calm, procedural, and cynical world of law enforcement did not understand. It was a language that immediately and fatally branded him not as a grieving partner, but as a potential suspect. The first note in the official file on the disappearance of Angela Brooks would be a simple, damning one. Reporting party is agitated, emotional, and potentially uncooperative. The official response was a study in procedural, soul-crushing indifference. Detective Miller, a 20-year veteran with a weary, cynical slouch and a deep, abiding belief that the simplest explanation was almost always the right one, was assigned the case. He arrived at Darnell's apartment to a scene that, to his experienced eye, was depressingly familiar. He saw a distraught and very angry young man. He saw a small, messy apartment, and he heard a story with no witnesses, no evidence, and no signs of foul play. He listened, with a practiced, paternalistic patience, as Darnell raged and pleaded, as he insisted that Angela would never have left, that she was a devoted mother, that something terrible must have happened. Miller had heard it all before. He had heard it from 100 other boyfriends, 100 other husbands, in 100 other sad, and ultimately, very simple, domestic disputes. "Son, you need to calm down," Miller said, his voice a low, tired monotone. 9 times out of 10, in a situation like this, she's just taken off for a little while to cool her head. "You two have a fight last night?" "A fight?" Darnell's voice was a raw, guttural cry of disbelief and fury. "We didn't have a fight. We were happy. Don't you understand? She's gone." "We'll look for her," Miller said, the words a hollow professional placation. He authorized a cursory search, a few patrol cars to drive the route, a single, brief helicopter flyover. It was a search designed not to find a missing person, but to fulfill a procedural requirement. In his own mind, the case was already closed. He saw a young, volatile couple, a likely fight, and a girlfriend who had decided to walk away. He was not a monster. He was not a bad cop. He was just a tired, overworked, and deeply cynical man who had seen too many stories that started this way. He had made a judgment call, a decision based on the grim, statistical probability of his profession. He had classified Angela Brooks as a probable runaway, and in doing so, he had, with the simple stroke of a pen, given the real monster, the quiet, friendly baker who was at that very moment flying his precious, human cargo into the vast, unsearchable wilderness, the one thing he needed most: a head start. Angela's new world was a universe of white, the white of the snow-covered ground that stretched to the horizon in every direction, the white of the low, heavy clouds that pressed down on the landscape, blurring the line between the earth and the sky, and the white, hot, and blinding fear that had consumed her mind. The flight in Bob Harlow's small, single-engine Cessna had been a terrifying, disorienting blur. She had been subdued, her hands bound, a thick black hood over her head that smelled of oil and old canvas. The drone of the engine, the violent, gut-wrenching turbulence of the small plane, the profound, absolute darkness of her own, personal void, it had all been a prelude to the nightmare that was to come. He had landed the plane on a frozen lake, the skis on its landing gear gliding smoothly over the snow-covered ice. He had led her, still hooded, a short distance through the deep snow to a small, isolated cabin. It was a place that felt like the end of the world, a tiny, man-made island in an ocean of profound and terrifying silence. When he had finally removed the hood, the sight that greeted her was one of a stark and brutal beauty. She was surrounded by a pristine, untouched wilderness, a landscape of jagged, snow-capped mountains and dense, dark forests of spruce and fir. There was no sign of human life, no roads, no power lines, no other cabins. They were utterly and completely alone. And then, The friendly, avuncular baker, the man who had been a symbol of warmth and safety in her life, had revealed his true, monstrous face. He was no longer Bob Harlow, the man who sold cinnamon rolls. He was a hunter. And she, he explained with a chilling, calm, and almost pedagogical clarity, was his prey. This was his game, his private, ultimate sport. A game he had been perfecting for years. He would give her a head start. A few hours. He would leave her a small, inadequate packet of supplies, a single blanket, a small knife, a box of matches. And then, he would hunt her. "The wilderness is the great equalizer, Angela," he said, his voice the calm, reasonable tone of a philosopher explaining a complex theory. "Out here, all the silly, artificial rules of the city, they don't matter. Out here, there is only the predator and the prey. It's the most honest relationship in the world. And it's beautiful." His delusion was absolute. His madness a quiet, intellectual, and utterly terrifying thing. He did not see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a purist, an artist, a man who was tapping into a more primal, more authentic way of being. He left her at the edge of the forest, the small, inadequate survival pack at her feet. "I'll see you soon," he said, his smile gentle, a grotesque, horrifying echo of the friendly baker she had known. And then he had turned and walked back to the cabin, his movements unhurried, a man completely and confidently in control of his own private and monstrous world. Angela was left alone, in the heart of a wilderness that was as beautiful as it was deadly. The cold was a physical, living thing, a presence that was already starting to seep through her thin, inadequate hotel cleaner's uniform. She was a city girl, a woman whose survival skills were limited to navigating a bus schedule and stretching a paycheck. She knew nothing of this world, but she was also a mother. And the image of her son, Jordan, his small, sleeping face, was a fire that ignited in the core of her being. It was a fire of a rage so pure, so powerful, that it burned away the cold, paralyzing terror. She would not be prey. She would not be a victim in this man's sick, twisted game. She was Angela Brooks. She was a mother, and she would survive. She would fight. She would find a way to get back to her son. She turned her face away from the cabin, and she ran, a lone, desperate, and incredibly, fiercely determined figure, into the vast, silent, and unforgiving wilderness. While Angela was fighting for her life in a frozen, white hell, Bob Harlow was back in his own personal paradise. The warm, fragrant, and universally beloved world of the daily bread. He had flown back to Anchorage the day after he had left Angela in the wilderness, his small plane landing at the local airfield without anyone paying it any mind. He was just Bob, the friendly baker, back from another one of his solo wilderness adventures. He washed the scent of the cold, clean, and violent wilderness from his skin, and he put on his familiar, comfortable, and flour-dusted uniform. He opened his bakery at the usual time, the warm, yeasty smell of his fresh-baked bread a beacon of comfort and normalcy that spilled out into the cold morning air. His performance was a masterpiece of sociopathic control. He was the same, friendly, cheerful Bob that the town had always known. He greeted his regular customers by name. He offered a free pastry to a wide-eyed child. He made small talk about the weather, his voice a low, comforting rumble. And then the gossip began. The news of Angela Brooks's disappearance was the talk of the town, a small, dark cloud that had settled over the close-knit community. Bob listened, his expression a mask of concerned and deeply feigned sympathy. He would shake his head sadly, a look of profound, neighborly sorrow in his kind, blue eyes. "Such a sweet girl," he would say to a customer, his voice a low, mournful sigh. "And that poor boy of hers. Just a terrible, terrible thing. I just pray she turns up safe." His bakery became the unofficial headquarters of the community's grief. The volunteer search parties, organized by a frantic and increasingly desperate Darnell, would often start and end their days there, warming their frozen hands on a cup of Bob's hot, strong coffee. Bob, in a gesture of profound and grotesque generosity, offered them all a discount. He was supporting the search for the very woman he had taken. The irony was a private, delicious, and deeply satisfying joke that only he was in on. He would sometimes see Darnell, his face a raw, ragged mask of a grief that was so profound it was almost a physical deformity. He would see the way the other people in the town would look at him, the whispers, the averted gazes. He knew that the police suspected him, that the community was slowly, but surely, turning him into the villain of the story. And Bob would watch, a quiet, almost paternalistic pity in his heart. The poor, angry, and very stupid young man had no idea that the real monster was the one who was handing him a warm cup of coffee, the one who was offering him a sad, sympathetic smile. Bob's double life was a seamless, effortless performance. The man who, just a day before, had been a cold, calculating hunter, a predator in a vast, amoral wilderness, was now a beloved, respected, and deeply compassionate pillar of his community. He was a man who was hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, in the warm, inviting, and blindingly bright light of his own good reputation. He was a monster who had successfully and completely camouflaged himself as a saint. The official search for Angela Brooks lasted less than a week. It was a cursory, half-hearted affair, a procedural gesture designed more to placate a grieving and increasingly volatile boyfriend than to actually find a missing person. When the search parties and the single brief helicopter flyover turned up nothing, Detective Miller officially, and with a sense of weary relief, suspended the active investigation. The Angela Brooks case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. For Darnell Carter, this was not an end. It was a declaration of war. He was a man who had been raised to believe in the system, in the simple, fundamental idea that if something terrible happened, the people in charge would do everything in their power to make it right. That faith had been shattered. He was now a man alone, a lone, furious warrior against a wall of official indifference. His life, which had been so completely and so beautifully centered around Angela and their son, was now consumed by a single, all-encompassing purpose: to find her. He refused to believe she was a runaway. He knew her. He knew the fierce, unwavering depth of her love for their child. The police narrative was not just a mistake. It was a slander, an insult to the memory of the woman he loved. He began his own, relentless, and deeply personal investigation. He worked his shifts at the auto shop with a kind of manic, furious energy, his grief and rage channeled into the hard physical labor of his trade. And every penny he earned, every penny he could scrape together, went into the search. He started by printing his own flyers. He used the best, most recent picture he had of her, a photo from Jordan's last birthday party, her face lit up with a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He plastered these flyers on every telephone pole, in every store window, on every community bulletin board in Anchorage. He became a familiar, sad figure, a ghost in his own city, a man who was a constant, walking, and increasingly ignored, reminder of a story the town wanted to forget. He organized his own search parties, rallying his small circle of loyal friends and a few compassionate strangers who were moved by his story. They would spend their weekends combing the frozen, unforgiving landscape around the city, searching the parks, the back alleys, the desolate, forgotten corners where a body might be hidden. But his resources were limited. His search was a desperate, amateurish, and ultimately fruitless effort against the vast, overwhelming power of the Alaskan wilderness. As the months bled into a year, his friends began to drift away, their own lives demanding their attention. The search parties grew smaller, and then they stopped altogether. Darnell was alone. But he was not defeated. He was a man possessed by a promise, a silent vow he had made to the smiling, hopeful face on the flyer. He would not stop. He would not give up. He would find her. He began to sacrifice the pieces of his own life, feeding them into the hungry, insatiable fire of his obsession. He started working double shifts, his days a seamless, 16-hour blur of grease, steel, and exhaustion. He sold his most prized possession, his beautifully restored, cherry-red, vintage pickup truck, the one he and Angela had taken on their first date. He sold it for a fraction of its worth, and he used the money to keep the flyers printed, to keep a small, desperate ad running in the local paper. He was a man who was systematically and deliberately burning his own life to the ground, a long, slow, and incredibly painful act of sacrifice. A sacrifice he was making for a woman the world had already forgotten, A woman he was determined to prove had mattered. Darnell Carter's lonely, obsessive search was a journey that often led him in circles, a repetitive, heartbreaking loop through the geography of his own grief. He would revisit the same places, ask the same questions, and be met with the same sad, pitying glances. His world had become a small, claustrophobic map of his own personal tragedy. And the center of that map, the one warm and seemingly compassionate place in the cold, indifferent city, was the daily bread. He would often find himself there, at the end of a long, fruitless day of searching, his body aching with a weariness that was bone deep. He would sit at the small wooden counter, a cup of hot, black coffee in his hands, and he would just stare out the window, at the city that had swallowed his life whole. The bakery was a sanctuary of a kind. It was a place where he was not just the angry boyfriend of that girl who ran away. The owner, Bob Harlow, the man the whole town loved, was always kind to him. He would greet Darnell with a soft, sympathetic smile, a look of profound and deeply feigned sorrow in his eyes. "Any news, son?" Bob would ask, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Darnell would just shake his head, his own voice a raw, ragged thing. "Nothing. Not a damn thing." "You keep the faith," Bob would say, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "A good woman like that, she'll find her way home. You just have to be patient." And then, he would slide a warm, fresh from the oven pastry across the counter. "On the house," he would say. "You need to keep your strength up." The kindness was a small, beautiful, and utterly, monstrously false thing. Darnell, in his raw, all-consuming grief, did not see the lie. He saw only a good man, a pillar of the community, offering a moment of human comfort to a man who was drowning. He would sit there, eating the warm pastry, drinking the hot coffee, and he would feel a fleeting, momentary sense of connection, of not being entirely alone in his fight. He was unknowingly and heartbreakingly breaking bread with the very monster he was hunting. He was accepting comfort from the man who had destroyed his life. The irony was a thick, suffocating, and completely invisible presence in the warm, fragrant air of the bakery. One day, a few years into his search, Darnell was in the bakery, and he saw Bob talking to a woman, a new face in town. Bob was telling her the story, his story, of the disappearance of Angela Brooks. He was a master storyteller, his voice a perfect instrument of sorrowful, dramatic narration. "She was a sweet girl," Bob said, shaking his head sadly. "But that boyfriend of hers, a real hothead. They were always fighting. He came in here, the day after she disappeared, screaming, cursing, a man completely out of control. I felt so sorry for her. I hope she found some peace, wherever she is." Darnell, who had overheard the conversation from his seat at the counter, felt a hot, white flash of pure, unadulterated rage. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell them the truth, that he was the boyfriend, that they had never fought, that she had been stolen. But he just stood there, his fists clenched, his body trembling, and he saw the way the other customers were looking at him. He saw the fear in their eyes. He saw the confirmation of the story Bob had just told. He was the hothead. He was the monster. He turned and walked out of the bakery, the familiar, comforting smell of the place now a sickening, cloying scent of hypocrisy. He did not know why, but in that moment, a small, cold, and formless seed of a suspicion, a thing he could not give a name to, was planted in the back of his mind. There was something wrong with Bob Harlow. Something about his kindness was too perfect. Something about his sympathy was too smooth. It was a feeling, a gut instinct, a thing he could not prove. But it was there, and it would, in the long, dark years to come, be the one, single thing that would keep him from giving up completely. By the mid-1980s, the Angela Brooks case in the Anchorage Police Department's archives was no longer a file. It was an artifact. It was a thin, flimsy folder, its corners soft and dog-eared, a relic from a different and long-forgotten era of the city's history. Detective Miller, the man who had made the initial, fateful decision to classify her as a runaway, had long since retired, his career a testament to the slow, grinding, and ultimately forgettable nature of most police work. The file had been passed down to a new generation of detectives, young men and women with fresh faces and a belief in new modern techniques like DNA and computerized databases. But the Angela Brooks file was a pre-digital ghost. It had no physical evidence to test, no complex crime scene to re-examine. It had only the initial report, a few cursory interview notes, and the final, damning, and deeply misleading classification: voluntary missing adult. Case suspended. The file was a perfect, self-contained, and self-perpetuating lie. Any new detective who might, in a moment of idle curiosity, pull it from the drawer would see the same, simple story. A young woman. A volatile boyfriend. A probable domestic dispute. The conclusion was right there. On the first page. There was no reason to dig any deeper. The system was designed to forget. In a city like Anchorage, a place that was a magnet for transient workers and restless souls, people disappeared all the time. The police department simply did not have the resources or the institutional will to launch a full-scale, multi-year investigation into every adult who decided to walk away from their life. They had to rely on patterns, on probabilities, on the grim, statistical logic that allowed them to triage their crushing caseload. And the Angela Brooks case had fit their pattern perfectly. But Darnell Carter, the one, single variable that the system had not accounted for, had refused to let the file sleep. He had become a familiar and deeply annoying fixture at the precinct. Every year, on the anniversary of Angela's disappearance, he would show up. He would ask to speak to the detective in charge of the cold case unit. And he would ask the same, simple, and in the eyes of the police, maddeningly pointless question: have you found her yet? The detectives would treat him with a kind of weary, professional pity. They saw a man who was trapped in the past, a man who could not accept the simple, painful truth of his own failed relationship. They would offer him a cup of bad, precinct coffee. They would listen, with a practiced, patient air, as he would once again plead his case. And then, they would gently, but firmly, show him the door. He was a ghost in their world, a living, breathing reminder of a case they considered closed. He was an irritant, an anomaly, a man who refused to fit into their neat, tidy, and deeply flawed narrative. But his persistence, his sheer, stubborn, and unwavering refusal to be silenced, was having a small, almost imperceptible effect. His yearly visits were a stone dropped into the still, stagnant waters of the cold case unit. The ripples were small, but they were there. A few of the younger detectives, the ones who had not been a part of the initial, flawed investigation, began to talk about him. They began to wonder, what if he was right? What if the old, jaded cops from the 80s had gotten it wrong? It was a dangerous thought. A heretical idea in the rigid, hierarchical world of a police department. But it was a seed that Darnell, in his lonely, obsessive, and incredibly, heartbreakingly persistent way, had planted. The forgotten file was not entirely forgotten. It was just sleeping, and it was waiting for a single, new, and irrefutable piece of evidence to come along and wake it from its long and very deep slumber. By the late 1980s, Darnell Carter was a man who had been hollowed out by his own relentless quest. The fire of his youthful rage had cooled, replaced by the cold, hard, and deeply pragmatic resolve of a long-distance runner. His life had been systematically stripped of everything but his job and his son. And his search. He had saved, with a monastic, single-minded devotion, every spare dollar he had earned from his double shifts at the auto shop. It was a small, pathetic pile of money. But it was, he knew, his last, and only, hope. The police had failed him. The community had forgotten. He had to find another way. He found Frank Holloway in a small, dusty office above a bail bondsman, the name on the frosted glass door, a simple, unadorned declaration. Holloway Investigations. Holloway was a man in his late 60s, a grizzled, semi-retired ex-state trooper with a face like a crumpled road map and eyes that had seen every kind of lie the human heart was capable of inventing. He was a man who operated on a simple and deeply cynical philosophy. Everyone was hiding something. His job was to find out what it was. He listened to Darnell's story in a gruff, almost bored silence. his expression unchanging. He had heard 1,000 stories of lost loves and broken hearts. He was not a man who was easily moved by emotion. He was a man who was moved by facts. "The cops say she ran off," Holloway said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, when Darnell had finished. "They say you two fought. Why should I believe you and not them?" "Because I knew her," Darnell said, his own voice quiet, steady, and full of a power that was more profound than anger. And because they never really looked. Something in Darnell's quiet, absolute certainty, in the sheer, stubborn, and unwavering conviction of his words, cut through Holloway's cynical armor. He saw not a hot-headed, spurned lover. He saw a man who was telling the truth. "This will cost you," Holloway said, a final, pragmatic warning. "Everything you have. And I might not find anything." "I know," Darnell said, "but you'll look. That's all I'm asking." Holloway took the case. And for the first time in 6 years, Darnell Carter was not alone in his fight. Frank Holloway was the antithesis of the Anchorage Police Department. He was not bound by bureaucracy, by budgets, by the crushing weight of 100 other cases. He had only one case, Angela Brooks, and he began his investigation with a methodical, old-school, and deeply effective simplicity. He started from the beginning. He did what Detective Miller had never bothered to do. He conducted a real, in-depth, and deeply human investigation. He re-interviewed Angela's friends, her co-workers, her family. He built a psychological profile of the victim, a portrait of a woman who was a devoted mother, a responsible employee, a person who was the absolute, polar opposite of a runaway. And then, he did something else the police had never done. He began to look for a pattern. He spent weeks in the dusty public archives, sifting through the old, forgotten records of other missing women in the Anchorage area. And he found them. 2 other women, both from similar working-class backgrounds, both officially classified as runaways, who had vanished without a trace in the past 5 years. He had his pattern. 3 women, all dismissed by the system. And now, he needed to find the link. The link, he suspected, was not to be found on the ground. It was to be found in the sky. The most crucial and most difficult part of his investigation was the flight logs. In the 1980s, the records of the small, private airfields that dotted the Alaskan landscape were notoriously inconsistent. But Holloway was a patient and incredibly persistent man. He spent months visiting these small, forgotten airfields, drinking bad coffee with old, grizzled pilots and mechanics, charming his way into their dusty, disorganized file rooms. And then he found it. A single, chilling, and absolutely undeniable correlation. In the days immediately following the disappearance of all 3 women, a single name appeared in the flight logs of the Anchorage Municipal Airfield: Robert Harlow. The beloved baker, the man the whole town trusted. The logs showed that he had filed flight plans for solo recreational trips into the remote, uninhabited wilderness. He would fly out for a day or 2, and then he would fly back. It was a perfectly normal, perfectly Alaskan thing for a man with a plane to do, but the timing was too perfect. It was a coincidence so profound that it could not possibly be a coincidence. Holloway now had his suspect. A suspect who was not the volatile, grieving boyfriend, but the quiet, gentle, and universally beloved baker. He had the pattern. He had the means. He had the opportunity. But he had no proof. He had a powerful, terrifying theory, a story that made a horrible, perfect kind of sense. But he had nothing to take to the police. Nothing but the gut feeling of a cynical old PI and a handful of old dusty flight logs. The hunt had a face, but the face was that of a saint, and no one, he knew, would ever believe him. Robert Harlow, in the years that followed Angela's disappearance, had settled into the comfortable, unassailable role of a local legend. His bakery was more successful than ever, a beloved institution that was a symbol of the city's heart and soul. He was a man who was, in the eyes of the community, beyond reproach. His confidence in his own, perfect, and monstrous secret had grown into a kind of serene, unshakable arrogance. The Alaskan wilderness, the vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent landscape that was the backdrop of their lives, was his greatest accomplice. It was a place that swallowed secrets whole, a place where a person could vanish without a trace. their story simply ending, a sentence without a period. He had committed the perfect crime, not once, but multiple times. He had honed his methods, perfected his performance. The selection of his victims was a cold, calculated process. He chose women from the city's margins, women who were less likely to be missed, whose disappearances were more likely to be written off by the authorities. He was a predator who understood and exploited the system's own inherent biases. The hunt itself was, for him, a kind of sacred, artistic ritual. It was not an act of chaotic, passionate violence. It was a controlled, intellectual game, a test of his own superior skill and intelligence against the primal, desperate will of his prey. He was a god in his own private and frozen Eden, a man who had transcended the petty, boring rules of the civilized world. His public persona, the gentle, kind, and generous baker, was not just a mask, it was a fortress. It was a wall of universal love and respect that was more secure than any prison. Who would ever believe that the man who gave children free cookies was a monster? The very idea was absurd, a preposterous, and deeply offensive. Fantasy. He was aware of Darnell Carter's long, pathetic, and in his eyes, deeply amusing quest for the truth. He would see the man's faded, sun-bleached flyers, and he would feel a quiet, satisfying sense of contempt. He saw not a grieving, devoted lover, but a stupid, angry animal, howling at a moon it could never reach. He was a man who had achieved a kind of perfect, monstrous, and utterly, soul-crushingly successful double life. The hunter was so completely and so perfectly hidden within the baker that the two had, in a way, become one. He was a man without a conscience, without remorse, without fear. He was a man who believed, with an absolute and almost religious certainty, that his secrets were safe, buried forever under 1,000,000 miles of snow, and a mountain of his own, good reputation. The story, it seemed, was over. A young woman had vanished. A good man had been broken by his grief. A monster was hiding and thriving in plain sight. The truth was a secret that only the vast, silent, and unforgiving wilderness knew. But the wilderness, as it turned out, was not as silent as he believed, and it was about to give up one of its ghosts. The turning point, the event that would finally, and violently, shatter the perfect frozen silence of the Angela Brooks case, came in the late summer of 1989. It came in the form of a young woman, a 20-year-old drifter whose name the world would soon know, a woman who had, against all odds, done the impossible. She had survived Robert Harlow's game. She had been his latest victim, another forgotten woman from the city's margins. He had followed the same, familiar script, the kind offer of a ride, the flight into the vast, remote wilderness, the small, isolated cabin, the chilling, philosophical explanation of the hunt. But this woman was different. She was a fighter, a creature of pure, feral, and unbreakable will. For 2 days she had played his game. She had run, she had hidden, she had used the small, inadequate tools he had given her with a skill and a cleverness that had surprised and even impressed him. On the 3rd day, she had done the unexpected. She had not run away from the cabin. She had run towards it. In the dead of night, while he was asleep, she had crept back, a silent, barefoot ghost in the darkness. She had found a loose rock by the foundation, and with a desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, she had smashed a window, grabbed a set of his truck keys from a hook by the door, and had run, not into the woods, but to the old, battered pickup truck he kept at the cabin for emergencies. The truck, which had not been started in years, had, by some miracle, roared to life. And she had driven, a wild, terrifying, and desperate flight down a series of long-forgotten, overgrown logging roads, with no map, no sense of direction, only a primal, desperate need to get away. For 2 days, she had driven, the truck running on fumes, until she had, by another miracle, stumbled upon a remote, active logging camp. The loggers, a group of rough, hard-bitten men, had found her a terrifying, almost inhuman apparition. A young woman, barefoot, her clothes in tatters, her eyes wide with a horror that was so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to be from another world. She had collapsed in their arms, and she had told them a A story of a kind, friendly baker, of a small airplane, of a cabin in the woods, and of a hunt. A story that was so bizarre, so monstrous, that it was almost impossible to believe. But they believed her. They drove her to the nearest state trooper outpost, a small two-man station in the middle of nowhere. And she told her story again. The troopers, who were used to dealing with the strange and often violent dramas of the Alaskan frontier, listened, their own faces a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. They knew who Bob Harlow was. Everyone knew who Bob Harlow was. The call was made to the Anchorage Police Department. The news was a seismic, earth-shattering event that sent a shockwave through the entire, unprepared department. The impossible, preposterous story of a lone, barefoot survivor had just provided them with what they had been missing for 6 long and negligent years, an irrefutable, living, and breathing witness. The impossible escape had just triggered a long overdue and very public avalanche of justice. The raid on the Daily Bread was not a quiet, tactical operation. It was a full-blown, public spectacle, a piece of high-stakes, real-world theater that played out in the stunned, disbelieving glare of the entire city of Anchorage. The news of the escapee's story had spread like wildfire, a rumor so monstrous, so unbelievable, that the entire town had poured into the streets, a mixture of morbid curiosity and a deep, profound, and deeply personal sense of betrayal. They found Bob Harlow where he always was, behind the counter of his bakery, a clean, white apron tied around his waist, his hands covered in flour. When the heavily armed SWAT team smashed through his front door, his reaction was not one of fear or of anger. It was a look of quiet, almost philosophical disappointment. The game was over, and he had, for the first time, lost. He surrendered without a fight. A quiet, compliant, and utterly, chillingly calm figure. The man the city had loved, the man they had trusted, the man they had believed to be a saint, was led from his warm, fragrant, and beautiful bakery in handcuffs, a monster who had finally and irrevocably been unmasked. While one team secured him, another, led by a pale, grim-faced, and long since retired Detective Miller, who had been called in as a consultant, executed a search warrant on his home. And there, in a small, hidden, and false-bottomed storage room in his basement, they found his trophies. It was a small, neat, and meticulously organized collection of horrors. A driver's license belonging to a woman who had been missing for 3 years. A single, silver earring. A faded, well-read paperback book. And, in a small, velvet-lined box, a collection of women's bracelets. Darnell Carter and the private investigator, Frank Holloway, were at the station when the evidence was brought in. They had been summoned by the police, their long, lonely, and thankless investigation now suddenly and violently vindicated. A young, humbled detective led them into an evidence room and showed them the bracelets. Darnell's hands were shaking, his heart a wild, frantic drum. He looked at the small, pathetic collection of a monster's keepsakes, and then he saw it. It was a small, simple, and impossibly, heartbreakingly familiar silver bracelet. It was thin, delicate, and on its surface, almost too small to read, was a single, engraved name. Jordan. It was the bracelet he had given Angela a few days after their son was born. The sight of it was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole all the air from his lungs. It was a moment of the most profound and most devastating victory imaginable. It was the irrefutable, final, and absolute proof that his 6-year, soul-crushing search was over. He had been right. She had not run away. She had been taken. She had been a victim. And now, she was, finally, and at last, found. The bracelet was not just a piece of evidence. It was a tombstone. It was an answer. And it was the final, devastating and vindicating end to his long and very lonely war. The trial of Robert Harlow was a civic exorcism, a public purging of a city's own collective guilt and disbelief. The man in the defendant's chair was a stranger, a quiet, impassive, and utterly chillingly normal-looking man who bore no resemblance to the warm, friendly baker they had all known and loved. The smiling, beloved icon had been a mask, a lie, and the city of Anchorage was forced, day after day, to confront the monster they had so willingly and so lovingly embraced. The testimony of the lone survivor was the heart of the trial, a harrowing and incredibly brave account of a nightmare made real. Her voice, quiet but unwavering, painted a picture of a predator so cold, so calculating, and so profoundly, monstrously evil that it defied all comprehension. But it was the testimony of Darnell Carter that was the soul of the trial. He took the stand, not as a hot-headed, angry young man, but as a quiet, weary, and incredibly dignified warrior who had been aged and hardened by a 6-year war that he had fought almost entirely alone. He did not speak of his anger. He spoke of his love. He told the jury about Angela. He told them about her quiet strength, about her deep, unwavering love for their son, about her small, simple dreams. He painted a portrait of a woman who was not a statistic, not a runaway, not a forgotten file in a dusty drawer. He made her real. He made her matter. And then, he told them about his search. He told them about the flyers, about the sleepless nights, about the slow, agonizing process of selling his own life to fuel his quest. He told them about the wall of official indifference he had faced, about the quiet, condescending pity of a system that had been so quick to judge and so slow to listen. His testimony was not a plea for justice for himself. It was a demand for honor for the woman he had lost. It was a quiet, powerful, and deeply moving indictment of a system that had failed her, and a community that had so willingly and so blindly looked the other way. The verdict was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was devastating. Robert Harlow was found guilty, a silent, unrepentant monster who was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in a prison of a different and more public kind. The final scene of the story did not take place in the courtroom. It took place on a cool, clear afternoon on a bluff overlooking the vast, gray, and beautiful expanse of the Cook Inlet. Darnell stood there, the wind whipping at his jacket, his son, Jordan, now a tall, quiet teenager, standing beside him. The 6 years of frantic, obsessive searching had taken their toll. Darnell was a man who had sacrificed everything. He was broke. He was tired. He was a man who would forever be haunted by the ghosts of what he had lost. But he was also a man who had been vindicated. He was a man who had, against all odds, found the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver bracelet. He pressed it into his son's hand. "Your mother was a fighter," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "She was the strongest person I have ever known. And they tried to forget her. They tried to say she didn't matter." He looked at his son, his own eyes, for the first time in a long, long time, clear, steady, and full of a quiet and very hard-won peace. "They can't ignore her anymore," he said. "She mattered." It was a somber and a beautiful victory, a testament to a love that had refused to be silenced, and a final, quiet, and deeply profound promise fulfilled. The end. Thank you for watching.